I had expected chains, maybe the blunt end of a rifle. What I found instead was sunlight, soft, humid, almost tender, glinting off cranes that moved with a rhythm too calm for war. For 3 years I had been told America was chaos wrapped in propaganda, a land of mongrels ruled by greed. But when I first set foot on Norfolk's steel docks, that June morning in 1943, it was my own certainties that began to crumble. 14 days across the Atlantic had made my legs unsteady, but it wasn't the sea that swayed me, it was the sight itself. White and black men worked shoulder to shoulder, sweat mixing freely beneath their hard hats as machines roared behind them. Women in oil-stained coveralls guided cranes higher than any cathedral spire I had ever seen. Children shouted headlines through the mist, voices cracking with the innocent impatience of life that hadn't yet learned the word enemy. No one ran. No one spat. The only thing sharper than the salt in the air was the realization that no one here feared us. "Die, spinnin', die, Amerikaner," I muttered. "The Americans are mad." The man behind me laughed softly, but there was unease in his eyes. Madness, after all, was easier to believe than kindness. The Norfolk Naval Base seemed endless cranes swinging over rows of ships, rails glittering with oil, freight cars stacked with cargo bound for every corner of the war. In one morning, they moved more tonnage than Hamburg could in a week. Yet, it wasn't their strength that unsettled me most. It was the ordinary peace around it. Civilians walked freely near warships. Vendors sold coffee and donuts within sight of destroyers. A brass band was playing something cheerful jazz, perhaps at a war bond rally. We, 2500 men of the Afrika Korps, stood at attention on American soil, expecting jeers, but the only sounds were the gulls and the lazy crackle of the loudspeaker announcing lunch breaks. No guards shouted. Orders came in patient German, translated perfectly. A captain explained that we would be processed according to the Geneva Convention, as though the words themselves still meant something. I had memorized those clauses once in training, useful trivia, never reality. Yet here an American officer read them aloud as if they were sacred text. When I handed over my papers, I noticed a sergeant with a Star of David stitched discreetly on his medical pouch. He was distributing Red Cross packages and asking about dietary needs in fluent German. A few of our men chuckled darkly, thinking it was a cruel joke. It wasn't. Another officer spoke of kosher meals available for those who require them. For a moment, the dock tilted beneath me again, not from the sea, but from the collapse of logic. How could an enemy army make room for the faith we had mocked? The medical inspection was the next impossibility. I was given the same penicillin dressing I'd heard our own surgeons whisper about, like a miracle reserved for generals. The disinfectant's sting smelled of mint and modernity. A black technician drew blood from a Wehrmacht officer who flinched as though touched by blasphemy. The American doctor only said, "You'll be fine, soldier," without irony. In Germany, that single act would have broken law. Here it was, procedure. We were led then to a mess hall where the air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and the rhythm of a baseball game on the radio. Americans ate at one end, we at the other. Same plates, same food. Their laughter wasn't forced, their curiosity brief. A few glanced our way, shrugged, and went back to cheering the game. They could sit within 50 feet of men who had tried to kill them and care more about a ball flying over a fence. That was the moment I realized power could look like indifference. As evening descended, I stood by the window of our barracks, wooden, lit by electricity that burned without dimming, and watched the cranes move under sodium lights. The noise of the port merged with the low hum of the generators, a sound so steady it felt eternal. My thoughts turned to the ruins of Benghazi, to the hunger, to the endless speeches about the superiority of order over chaos. But this was chaos that worked. I wrote my first note in the small notebook they'd allowed me to keep. If this is the enemy, then our maps are wrong. The band outside struck up another tune. the notes carrying faintly across the water. Somewhere beyond the dock, an American child laughed. I had never felt further from home, and never closer to understanding what defeat truly meant. The next morning began with the sound of marching boots on gravel, but even that seemed softer here. The Americans didn't bark orders. They spoke them as if expecting to be obeyed simply because reason made more sense than fear. It confused us more than shouting ever could. We were ushered into a large administrative hall, where posters of smiling soldiers and women with factory wrenches hung beside English words we couldn't yet read, but somehow understood: freedom, liberty, responsibility. Inside, a tall lieutenant with round glasses stood behind a table and addressed us in perfect German. He read aloud the articles of the Geneva Convention, pausing after each one to explain what it meant in practice. He said we would have access to medical care, religious rights, and correspondence with our families. Some men laughed quietly. I didn't. There was a weight in his calmness that no propaganda film had ever prepared me for. They examined us one by one. When my turn came, the medic unwrapped my hand, wound from North Africa, a ragged scar from shrapnel that had never healed properly. He applied a clean white bandage and said, "Penicillin. You'll be fine in a few days." His accent was southern, his hand steady. I noticed his skin dark as polished mahogany and the Red Cross emblem shining on his sleeve. I froze. Back home, that sight would have drawn disgust or punishment. Here it was simply normal. He didn't see an enemy or a symbol. He saw a patient. Later I learned his name, Corporal Thompson. He smiled when I thanked him in broken English. I remember thinking that my entire education had just been rewritten by a single act of mercy. The dining hall awaited us next. Long rows of tables stretched under humming electric lights, the air heavy with coffee and cooked meat. At one end sat American sailors in their blue uniforms, laughing at a radio that spoke the language of leisure baseball commentators, calling plays like poetry. We were seated at the other end, guarded but not glared at, and the trays placed before us carried the same food as theirs. Mashed potatoes, green beans, gravy thick as memory. For a few moments, no one touched the plates. We waited for mockery, for the inevitable insult. None came. I remember lifting the fork as if testing reality itself. The food was hot. The flavor, simple but rich, sent a strange ache through my chest. It wasn't about hunger anymore. It was about dignity. Around me, men began eating in silence, their eyes shifting toward the Americans laughing at the radio, a sound so casual it hurt. Later, we were shown the quarters where we'd sleep before our transport westward. Wooden barracks, clean sheets, light bulbs that glowed without flicker. The electricity fascinated me. It seemed eternal, something that never had to be rationed. Through the open door I could see an American sergeant joking with a dock worker, both laughing so freely it made me wonder if fear was something they simply didn't understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air smelled faintly of salt and machine oil, but it was the memory of that medic's hands that stayed with me. I thought of the word enemy, how it had once carried certainty, and now it felt like a question. Before lights out, an officer came by, his voice low and almost kind. "You'll be transferred inland tomorrow," he said. "You'll find things different there." I asked him where we were going. He smiled. "Texas." He left, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, the hum of the electric bulb filling the silence like an endless pulse. For the first time since the war began, I didn't feel captured. I felt observed by something larger than armies, something that didn't need to prove its strength by cruelty. And that frightened me more than any weapon. The train that carried us west was not the cattle car I had imagined. It was a passenger coach, cushioned seats, glass windows, even fans that hummed lazily against the early summer heat. When we boarded, I caught the faint scent of soap and tobacco, not fear. The guards didn't brandish rifles. They leaned against doorways, drinking coffee from tin cups and talking about baseball scores. Everything about the journey seemed designed to unsettle what we thought we knew about war. We rolled out of Norfolk before dawn. The sea disappeared behind us, replaced by fields, and then cities that gleamed in morning light. At every station, Americans gathered to watch. They didn't shout. Some were curious, others indifferent, but none looked afraid. In Washington, we stopped long enough to see families kissing sons goodbye as they boarded troop trains heading the opposite direction. I pressed my face to the glass. Mothers held babies in one arm, flags in the other. Teenagers shared milkshakes at the station cafe, laughing as if the war were some faraway rumor. Our guard noticed me watching and said softly, "They'll be fine." He didn't look at me with hatred, only certainty. That quiet confidence felt heavier than any threat. Through Baltimore, I saw the Glenn L. Martin aircraft plant massive hangars, endless rows of B-26 bombers gleaming like silver fish waiting for flight. There were no camouflage nets, no secrecy. Even the name of the company stood bold against the walls in letters tall enough for us to read from the train. In Germany, such openness would have been unthinkable. We built our planes underground, in shadows. Here, they built them under sunlight, as if daring the world to look. The further we went, the stranger it became. Pennsylvania's hills rose like folds of green armor. At night, the sky glowed orange from blast furnaces that never stopped. We passed steel mills, coal mines, and towns lit with hundreds of small electric fires, each house with its own light, its own garden, its own world. The glow spilled across the rails like proof of an inexhaustible faith in tomorrow. When we stopped in Harrisburg, I saw workers coming off shift. They wore clean shirts, leather shoes, and wristwatches. Some drove cars home. Others tossed half-eaten apples into trash bins and unwrapped new ones without thought. That casual waste stung more than any insult. A few of us laughed bitterly, men who had once fought over crusts in the desert, now staring at fruit thrown away by laborers. I remember one man muttering, "They don't even guard their factories," and another answering, "They don't have to." The landscape changed again, flat plains stretching toward forever. Small towns drifted past, their church steeples glinting like compass needles under the sun. I began to write notes in the margin of my issued booklet, small thoughts I couldn't voice aloud. They live without fear. They work without overseers. They speak freely. These observations felt treasonous and liberating at the same time. Somewhere near Street Lewis, an American conductor entered our car to check head counts. He nodded politely and said, "Hope the ride's comfortable, boys. No mockery, just routine." His tone startled me. In the Reich, civility was rationed like bread. Here, it seemed infinite. The hum of the wheels became hypnotic. Hours passed in a rhythm of rail clicks and half-sleep dreams. I dreamed of our columns in Africa, dust-coated, hungry, desperate, and woke to see green fields rolling endlessly, dotted with barns and telephone lines. Even their emptiness seemed full of life. By the third day, when the conductor announced Texas, the name felt mythical, like something from a Western film I once saw before the war horses, cowboys, vast skies. But as we crossed into the state, I realized it wasn't myth at all. It was a different civilization built not on conquest, but on excess, a place where power didn't have to roar to be felt. We disembarked at a small station outside a town called Hearne. The air was thick with heat and cicadas, the scent of dust and wild grass replacing the salt of the sea. A hand-painted sign read, "Welcome to Hearne, Texas, home of the Fighting Eagles." It might as well have read, "Welcome to the future." An American officer met us there, clipboard in hand. He spoke our language with a faint southern drawl. "Gentlemen," he said, "this will be your new home for a while. Follow me, and we'll get you settled." I felt a strange pull between humiliation and awe. Home. The word didn't belong here, yet somehow it fit. As we marched toward the camp gates shimmering in the distance, the sun set behind the endless plain, painting everything gold. I thought of what I had seen in those 3 days, the lights, the laughter, the waste, the calm, and realized that America's most dangerous weapon wasn't its machines. It was its normalcy. The road to the camp shimmered like a mirage under the Texas sun. Dust clung to our uniforms, turning every man the same dull color of surrender. But when the gates finally appeared painted white, guarded, yet oddly welcoming, it didn't feel like the prison I had braced for. Inside stretched rows of neat wooden barracks, roofs glinting under the light, and beyond them, a water tower rising like a sentinel of civility. The sign above the entrance read simply, Camp Hearne. An American officer stood waiting at the gate, tall, with a thin mustache and eyes that didn't look for enemies. He greeted us in German, good, proper German, and introduced himself as Lieutenant Colonel Cecile Stiles. His accent carried faint traces of university halls, not the battlefield. He explained, almost apologetically, that we would manage much of our daily life ourselves. Elections would be held for camp representatives. Complaints could be filed. Rules were to be followed, but dignity would be maintained. We had marched through villages where prisoners were treated like insects, where death itself was routine. To hear the word election inside barbed wire borders, it felt like mockery. But Stiles's tone was steady, too rational for deceit. When I looked around, I realized even the guards seemed bored rather than cruel. That was its own kind of power. Our barracks smelled of pine and soap. Each man had his own bed metal frame, real mattress, clean sheets. Above each bed hung an electric bulb, something so small yet so rare that it felt like luxury. Hot water hissed through pipes into the showers, filling the air with steam. Someone laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in months. Medical inspection followed. The camp hospital looked like a small civilian clinic. White walls, tiled floors, glass cabinets filled with instruments. A wounded soldier, one of ours, was taken in for appendicitis. Within hours, he was on a surgical table, operated on by an American doctor, Captain William Calhoun, with assistance from German medics. I stood near the door, pretending to translate orders, and heard Calhoun say, "You'll be fine, my friend," before the ether mask covered the man's face. That was not the language of vengeance. The next revelation came in the form of a small building marked Canteen. Inside were shelves stocked with cigarettes, soap, notebooks, even chocolate. We were told we could buy anything using camp scrip, a kind of paper money earned through voluntary work. One man touched the chocolate as though it were gold. "Enemies with pocket money," he muttered. I understood him. The privilege felt absurd. Soon the labor rosters were posted. I was assigned to a work detail on a cotton gin near a town called Bryan, part of the endless agricultural empire of Texas. Each morning, trucks carried us out of camp, past open fields stretching to the horizon. The land was alive with sound machines threshing, engines coughing, men shouting in English and Spanish. And among them, for the first time, I saw something that broke another boundary. Black and Mexican workers standing beside German prisoners, all doing the same work, earning the same pay. It was disorienting. In Germany, the idea of racial equality had been crushed under iron slogans. Here, though imperfect, it was visible, tangible, something lived rather than preached. I watched a black ranch hand, named Samuel, teach one of our men how to tie a rope knot. "Don't fight the pull," he said, tightening it. "Let it guide you." The words weren't about rope. On Sundays, we rested. I wandered to the recreation hall, ping-pong tables, a small library, even a piano. The Americans had given us instruments, books, and paints. Some men began sketching portraits of guards or of home, others played old German songs on borrowed guitars. It felt like a small, stubborn rebellion against despair. But slowly, I realized the Americans encouraged it on purpose. They didn't want to break us. They wanted us to rebuild ourselves. At night, the camp lights glowed like a city within fences. Fireflies hovered near the barbed wire, blinking against the electric lamps. I sat outside and listened to the sound of the generator, that constant heartbeat of modernity. In the distance, I could hear laughter from the American camp kitchen, the clatter of plates, a song about stars deep in the heart of Texas. I wrote another note in my journal. The barbed wire keeps us in, but the light reaches farther than I thought. Weeks passed, and the boundaries blurred further. Farmers began greeting us by name. At the ranch where I worked one humid morning, I saw an aircraft, small, silver, civilian, circling low to inspect the herds. The rancher called it cattle patrol. To me, it was something else, a sign of impossible abundance, of leisure existing beside war. That night, lying on my bunk, I thought about what our officers had taught us, that the Reich was unbreakable, that the enemy was weak, decadent, disorganized. Yet every day here I saw order without fear, wealth without brutality, and freedom that didn't need permission. When the lights flickered off, the darkness felt gentler than any I'd known. Somewhere beyond the camp fence, a coyote called into the night, a lonely sound carried over the prairie wind. I closed my eyes and wondered, not for the first time, whether we were the ones truly imprisoned. December arrived quietly in Texas, with cool wind sweeping through the pecan trees and dust settling soft as flour across the camp roads. We had been there half a year by then. The fences still stood, but inside them, life had changed shape. Some men painted, some studied English, some even joked with guards. I had stopped counting the days. The war, for me, had begun to fade into something distant and half-imagined, like a fever dream that no longer burned. Then came Christmas. Rumors spread that the townspeople of Hearne were sending gifts. We laughed at first. It had to be propaganda. But on the morning of December 24th, the gates swung open, and trucks began to arrive. School buses, church wagons, family cars loaded with boxes wrapped in bright paper. Children carried handmade cards. Local veterans unloaded crates of cigarettes and candy. Women hung garlands on the barbed wire as if it were a festival fence. The guards didn't stop them. They smiled. Some helped tie ribbons. That evening, the camp lights burned brighter than I had ever seen. A 30-foot Christmas tree stood in the main compound, strung with colored bulbs that glowed against the dark sky. We gathered around it in silence. Then the choir from the First Methodist Church arrived, American mothers, their voices uncertain at first, but growing stronger as they sang Stille Nacht in careful, foreign syllables. I felt something inside me give way. These were women whose sons were fighting us overseas, perhaps even dying, and yet here they stood, singing to the men who had aimed rifles at their children's faces. It was the most unbearable mercy I had ever witnessed. Later that night, we feasted like kings. Roast turkey, ham, pies, even wine for the officers. Someone read out the menu, and laughter, real laughter, rolled through the hall. For hours, the camp forgot its fences. I remember sitting beside a guard from Oklahoma who told me about his wife, about the crops he planned to grow after the war. He passed me a cigarette and said, "Freedom's a hard thing to kill, pal." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The next weeks brought another kind of transformation, quieter but deeper. Books arrived for the library. Thomas Mann, Remarque, even Jewish writers we had been taught to despise. Professors from a nearby college began teaching English and history courses. We could study agriculture, mathematics, politics. They called it education. But I began to see it for what it was, a dismantling of illusion. I enrolled in an English class taught by a man named Professor Allen. He spoke slowly, patient as sunrise, and once said something I'll never forget. Democracy isn't a system, it's a habit. At the time, I didn't understand. Later, watching Americans argue freely, criticize their president, laugh at their generals, I began to. In the evenings, some of us produced a newspaper called Der Spiegel, the Mirror. The early issues dripped with empty slogans, the kind we had memorized under the Reich. But over months, the tone shifted. We started debating, questioning, writing stories about ordinary life. One article praised an American farmer for teaching a prisoner how to repair a tractor engine. Another explored jazz music, how something once condemned as degenerate could make men of every color tap their feet in the same rhythm. There was power in that realization that rhythm needed no permission. One Sunday in January, I was invited with a few others to attend church in town. We sat quietly among the congregation, the air filled with the smell of pine and perfume. I remember a woman in the pew ahead of me turning, smiling, and handing me a hymn book. For a second her fingers brushed mine. She didn't flinch. It was such a small thing, but I felt the walls inside me collapse completely. Back in camp, the Special Projects Division had begun something new, leadership groups, they called them. They gathered prisoners who showed curiosity rather than defiance, and taught us about governance, about rights and responsibilities. Some men resisted, sneering that it was brainwashing, but I knew better. It wasn't indoctrination. It was exposure to ideas, to contradictions, to freedom itself. Every night I wrote in my notebook under the weak light of the bulb above my bunk. They defeated us without firing another shot. They are teaching us to live, not to obey. When the mail came that winter, I received a letter from home, my village near Hamburg, half ruined by bombings. My mother wrote that food was scarce, that the neighbors whispered of collapse. I folded the letter carefully and stared at the words until they blurred. Then I looked around at the camp, the men laughing over chess, the library lights spilling into the night, the guards talking softly near the fence. I thought of my mother's hunger and the American abundance that surrounded me, and I understood painfully that mercy can wound as deeply as cruelty. Still, that Christmas had marked us all. Even those who cursed America could not unsee what they had witnessed, a people so confident in victory that they shared comfort with enemies. In the months that followed, I stopped thinking of escape. I wanted to understand. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing, but inside the fences of Camp Hearne, something else was being built, a strange, quiet version of the peace that would come after. We no longer marched as soldiers but moved like men rediscovering how to walk without orders. The guards were fewer now, more relaxed. Some even played football with us in the open fields beyond the barracks. The air had changed. It smelled of hay, tobacco, and something impossible to name, trust, perhaps. Classes multiplied. There were lectures about city management, farming techniques, even democracy itself. The officers of the Special Projects Division spoke to us not as prisoners, but as future citizens of a country we had once been told didn't deserve to exist. "You'll return to rebuild," they said. "And when you do, remember how this worked." I remember one evening after a civics class, Professor Allen, the same man who had taught us English, drew a triangle on the chalkboard. "Government," he said, "isn't a pyramid built from fear. It's a balance of trust." He looked at me then, straight into the part of me that still clung to old certainties, and added, "Dictatorships collapse when people stop pretending obedience is loyalty." His words stayed with me longer than any sermon. When the news came that Hitler was dead, no one cheered. We sat in stunned silence. Some cried, others prayed. I simply stared at the barbed wire fence that had come to mean safety more than captivity. The guards didn't gloat. They brought us newspapers, real American ones filled with arguments, satire, even criticism of their own leaders. It was bewildering. They had won, yet they still questioned themselves. That, I thought, was the true difference. As repatriation began, the Americans prepared us for the return to a world of rubble. They taught us how to organize city councils, run farms, manage factories. Many of us learned trades, mechanics, carpentry, engineering. They spoke of something called the Marshall Plan before it even had a name, explaining that they wouldn't punish Germany, they'd rebuild it. The idea was so radical that it felt like a trick. But it wasn't. They meant it. When my turn came to leave, I walked to the gates, slowly, notebook in hand. Inside were months of thoughts, sketches, words I would never have dared to write before. "Freedom's a habit," Alan had said. I was beginning to understand. We saluted Lieutenant Colonel Stiles one last time. He nodded and said in German, "You'll take America with you, whether you like it or not." He was right. The train home rolled through the same heartlands that had first stunned us 2 years earlier. The lights still burned in every window. The factories still roared. Children waved as our train passed. Somewhere near Harrisburg, I caught a reflection in the glass my face. Thinner, older, but softer somehow. I no longer saw a soldier. I saw a man who had witnessed the enemy's greatest weapon, decency. Years later, I would return to Texas as a free man. Many of us did. We wrote letters to our guards, sent Christmas cards, even named our children after the Americans who had treated us like humans when the world said we weren't. Some of us became teachers, engineers, artists. A few of us stayed in the United States, building lives from the fragments of war. I visited Camp Hearne again in 1984 for the reunion. The barracks were gone, replaced by grass and wind. The old American veterans greeted us with handshakes and laughter. We placed flowers at the local memorial, and I remember one of my former guards whispering, "You boys came as enemies and left as friends." That night, standing under the Texas stars, I realized he was wrong about one thing. We hadn't left as friends. We had left as believers in something we hadn't known we were missing. Freedom was not chaos. Mercy was not weakness. And dignity, when given even to enemies, could rebuild entire nations. The war had taken years from us, but America had given us something timeless in return. A glimpse of how humanity might win, even when armies do. I closed my eyes and heard again the distant sound of that first brass band in Norfolk, the music that had once sounded like madness. Now it sounded like faith. And in that moment, I understood the truth I had been circling all along. They conquered us not through fire, but through light.